A pandemic of violence floods the streets of major cities as cases of the media-dubbed murder virus, MV20, soar, causing those infected to go on killing sprees. Caught in the middle, police detective Angela Miller finds her only trustworthy ally in the self-proclaimed psychic PI, Gerald Henry. As the two try to navigate the violence, they are drawn into New Age guru Abramelin Harvest's plot to heal the planet. Harvest's missive?
The world is sick, and humanity is the infection.
The cure? Murder. From the twisted mind of Sean C. Baker, author of A Collection of Desires and Shadow Play Book 1, Kim and Jesse, comes his most vicious novel yet, Murder Virus. Available where books are sold.
Hi, this is Sean from the Horror Vision Horror Podcast. So just a brief warning, we are going to be going deep spoiler territory. Ray, myself, and Professor John Trafton. And I just want to give everybody a warning, if you haven't seen Messiah of Evil, I don't necessarily know that spoilers are something that will affect your viewing of the movie. It's not narrative driven. However, I just wanted to be polite and let you know that that's where we're going. So we're going to start a little bit more on the surface level and dive deep. You've been warned.
They're peering around buildings at night, and they're waiting. They're waiting for you. And they'll take you one by one, and no one will hear you scream. No one will hear you scream!
Hello, welcome to another episode of the Horror Vision Horror Podcast. I'm Sean.
I'm Ray.
And our guest today is Professor John Trafton. John, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me,
Hey,
Sean.
welcome.
So, John, you are a professor of film, yes?
Yes, professor of film studies at Seattle University.
And you were originally born in Los Angeles?
Yeah, I'm born and raised in Los Angeles, Verdugo Hills area, Pasadena area. is
Okay.
where I grew up, but really just sort of all over. I lived in Silver Lake, Culver City area, and then spent a great deal of time in Orange County.
Ah,
Really all
Nice.
over then.
yeah. Which is interesting because that'll kind of parlay into something in your article. So let me tell people the way that this happened, that I invited John on. So recently, Shudder added Messiah of Evil, 1973, Gloria Katz and John, is it Hyuk?
Willard Hyuk.
I'm sorry, Willard Hyuk.
I know, such a good horror name for a horror director, Willard.
Yeah, right. So they added that, and I had been wanting to watch this movie for a couple years. I originally, on the old Shockwaves podcast, heard Rebecca McKendry talk about it, and I'd never heard of it before, which, not that I have this all encompassing knowledge, but the guys, when I still lived in Chicago, the guys that really kind of turned my love of horror into an obsession had such vast knowledge and collections that normally if somebody mentions something, I've heard of it. And so then what I find out is, oh, this movie never went to, it didn't go to DVD until like 2009. And at the time that Rebecca McKendry mentioned it, or shortly thereafter, I noticed it did come to Prime, but the copy they had was unwatchable. I mean, it's like, you can sometimes find like old TV shows on YouTube, and it's just unwatchable.
Yeah, there was a pretty piss poor quality of it on YouTube for like a great deal of time, and then they've just recently put out a pretty decent Blu-ray.
Do you know who put it
but-
out? Is that the Code Red?
Gosh, no, I would have to double check on it, but I think that what's really striking about this whole thing, this whole journey, is that this is a film that really was kind of a work in progress. It was like the two filmmakers, as you mentioned, Willard Huyck and Gloria Katz, they were like, fresh out of UCLA Film School and USC Film School, respectively. They were also really involved in that Roger Corman, Russ Myers world. And then they do this film, they submit it to different distributors as a work of progress with like a temp track on it by using old Alfred Hitchcock, Bernard Herrmann scores. And then,
wow.
The final distributor, after like they shot it in 71, released it in 73, and after several attempts to get it distributed, get some financing first so they can kind of finish it properly and give a proper edit, the distributor just takes it off their hands, edits it with like a new score, the one that, of course, we hear throughout the film. And I've got the guy's name written down here, Phillian Bishop's score.
Yeah.
And like the original ending was sort of altered and feels kind of rushed. So, all in all, this is not a film that is necessarily going to blow you away in the way that, other films from the 70s, like The Exorcist or The Omen, or Nicholas Roeg's Don't Look Now, which is probably one of my favorite horror films from the 70s. It's not gonna blow you away like those films, but you are definitely in for an interesting treat because there are a lot of ingredients in this film that are endlessly fascinating, and it is very watchable.
Well said. And that was the thing with this movie, was so I finally get to see it, and the copy that Shudder adds is pristine, and so it's sourced from that Blu-ray, which is the 40th anniversary Blu-ray. I just looked it up, and immediately I want to read about this film. As soon as it ends, I'm like, I got to read about it, and so there's not a lot to read.
There wasn't a whole lot. There wasn't a whole lot that I had to work on, and really, this article was kind of an afterthought, really, because I was working.
Really?
Yeah, because I was doing research on a book that I had just recently written. It's going through the publishing process right now, and it's sort of about LA and film. I had just taught a class about LA and film, so I was really kind of had a lot of this material. And I just sort of kept returning to this film because I had discovered it years and years and years ago through Tom Anderson's film, Los Angeles Plays Itself. It features in that film. It's a video essay documentary. It features in it. Incidentally, Tom Anderson, the creator, was a friend of both Willard Huyck and Gloria Katz at the time. I came to it and I just realized, what, this is kind of interesting. I'm going to just knock out, a little article because I had some thoughts, because I just thought this is like just laden with all this LA pop art, and that, so just like how the film was kind of an accidental film, the article that you read was kind of an accidental article.
That blows me away, because so your article, so I'm looking at this Kim Newman, the Nightmare Movies, Horror on the Screen Since the 60s. That's the book, and it's out of print or whatever. So as I'm looking around that, I think somehow through researching that book, I found your article. And your article, which is on johntrafton.com, Messiah of Evil, Film and the Influence of LA Pop Art, published July 22nd, 2019. You pull in so many, and you say right away, you set up the article beautifully in that, the essay beautifully in that you say you set up the film, but you're like, what I really want to talk about with this film isn't necessarily what everybody else might want to talk about. It's about the influence of LA on this movie. And I think that's the thing that's caught me so much about watching the film was, like I didn't know it was a work in progress. It makes sense, but it isn't the plot necessarily that grabbed me and pulled me through. It was the visuals and the pop art, especially. I mean, the first thing I wanted to know is, so the main location, which is, in a nutshell, our main character, Arletty, is looking for her father, who's an artist that lives in this beach community called, fictional beach community called Point Dune. She goes up there, he's disappeared, so she's staying in his home. And his studio / bedroom is probably the main location of the film. And I've never seen anything that looks like that in my life ever. And I wanted to know, like, was this just something, did they know somebody who actually had this, or did they design this for the movie?
Well,
and so that's where I got into your article.
Well, you kind of got to think about this in terms of like Malibu, just sort of that whole Malibu area. Point Doom, where the iconic, ending scene of Planet of the Apes, they shot that there, and Barton Fink, the little beach party at Jackie Treehorn's house.
Yes.
On that beach. Further on up, Donnie, his ashes are spread, in the Big Lebowski. And it's just, so you got like this whole area that really does have like a rich cinematic past. It goes all the way back to film noir. And so it's kind of film noir territory. Mildred Pierce, the home for Mildred Pierce is in like on the same road as Arletty's father.
Wow.
Home is in Messiah of Evil. And it's so, and the LA thing, I guess I would just really kind of say for your listeners, it's just sort of like, yeah, we've got a horror film, we've got a zombie film, or I guess there's zombies, whether the jury's kind of out whether they're meant to be zombies or vampires. Not really that kind of unusual, but what I did find unusual is it's really, really kind of difficult to find horror cinema that explicitly uses LA and Southern California as a location. I mean, yeah, they're shot in Southern California, many, many, many of them. There are some that, like independent ones and like exploitation and straight to VHS, grindhouse stuff from the 80s that,
Right.
you can tell it's in LA or Southern California, locale. Poltergeist is kind of does that as well. But like something that is like explicitly says, this is Southern California, this is north of LA, this is like a drive, like in where, and because if you're going to refer to a particular region and you're going to, or to a particular city, then that there's a whole bunch of cultural connotations that are attached to that location that you want to spring to mind in the viewers, which that was kind of sort of the genesis of saying, okay, I'll write something about this film because there's a lack of that, in the horror canon. And clearly Huck and Katz knew what they were doing and why they wanted to do it. And so they found this house. They were shooting the exteriors, the interiors with like the swinging. It's like I almost kind of want to maybe spend at least one night on that.
Yeah.
There's a bed that the main character Arletty is sleeps on, that is essentially a swing, like surrounded by like all of this like sort of Ed Ruscha, and Ed Kleinholz, style pop art. And that was an interior that was shot in some home in Echo Park.
But now, so was that art actually there, or that's the product of the art team, right?
Some of it was a product of the art team. You'll see Jack Fisk, who does work with Malick and Paul Thomas Anderson, and just recently David Lynch, and the film he's working on right now is he's doing the new Scorsese film being shot in Kansas with DiCaprio and De Niro. So some of that was him. Other than that, and I forget the name of the person. It was some of it was at this person's home in Echo Park. Like a lot of it was just sort of the natural work because it was an artist living in Echo Park. And one of the people that worked on the film was this woman named Judy Friskin, who was a still photographer inspired by Ed Ruscha. And they used a lot of her photography in the film, a few of like sort of the blow up figures maybe that you'll see in sort of the background. More than likely she would have been involved in. And
Okay.
it's really kind of easy to understand this because, they're being graduates of USC and UCLA during the late 60s. This was an era where there was so much experimental art going on, especially like with modern art, with art galleries like the Ferris Gallery, really, really playing a big role in the cultural landscape in LA during the 1960s, that film students were really drawn to this idea of hybridity, experimental art and other experimental forms, and more commercial narrative cinema. Film students back then sort of saw those two worlds as having a lot more porous boundaries, really kind of like for the first time since the 1920s. And unfortunately that kind of dissipated into the late 70s and the 80s. And there was a period, of course, during the 30s and 40s and 50s where it was kind of there, but it wasn't as pronounced. And really during the 60s, there was this big flash in the pan moment where, you look at a lot of the independent artwork and, even something like, Huck and Katz were really, really good friends with George Lucas, during the time. And they had, and they saw what he was doing with THX 1138. So, and that's just a perfect example of that. And they're like, why don't we just sort of apply this to this horror genre, which we kind of, really kind of honed our skills doing when we were working for Russ Myers and Roger Corman.
Wow. Ray, what did you think? Well, go ahead. I was going to ask, just opinions or whatever.
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, I didn't think about until you said it just now, the whole thing about art. Well, I mean, I read the article, but about how experimental cinema became in the early 70s until just now. When you said that, like, it made me think about, like, was this a film that ever played as like a midnight movie? Because it feels like it would have been perfect for that. I mean, considering that there's people like, I mean, Sean and I are obviously, we're both fans of Lynch's and like Eraserhead, but like, I'm also a big fan of Jodorowsky and like, El Topo, like being like one of the first big midnight movies. And like, he really is like making these films that are not just films, they're like pieces of art. And like, it's kind of the problem, like kind of why they don't have a bigger audience and why they're almost so like difficult to approach for people, because he's not just doing this thing of like, here's just this movie, I'm telling a story. It's also like, I'm doing something with the visual medium, I'm doing this thing. And it makes it more difficult for the common viewer. And when I saw the film, when I had not heard of Sigh of Evil until it hit Shudder, but when I watched it, the ending turned it around for me. Because otherwise I was like, this movie, it's slow moving. It is slow moving. The visual style is amazing though. The visual style is amazing. But it is slow moving, but the ending ironically turned it around. It did feel rushed. I didn't realize that until you said it. But I mean, it did feel rushed. I didn't realize it, like they had not, that it had kind of been cobbled together, it sounds like, or maybe rushed into production to get it done. But it made me think of films like Cabinet of Toxicology, or like what did I say? What was the other one I said the other night, Sean? Carnival of Souls, which are very heavy on the visual medium and like very much like you can see the art influence there in those films. So was this ever like a midnight movie?
Well, first of all, I just have to say right off the bat, Ray, buddy, as a fellow Jodorowsky fan, I can definitely see where you're coming from. I use Jodorowsky in my teaching quite frequently. And did it ever become a midnight movie? I don't know about midnight movie, but it did get a pretty good run through the 70s, through the theatrical circuit, especially in the local LA art house circle, it did get a pretty good run that way. In fact, it actually during the LA sequence in Woody Allen's Annie Hall, like they actually you see it on a movie theater marquee in the background during that sort of montage sequence.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so clearly in '76 when they were shooting that film in LA, it was definitely, having a pretty good run. And then they tried to kind of piggyback on the whole Romero legacy. And even before there was a Return of the Living Dead, the distributor tried to remarket it, changing it from Messiah of Evil to Return of the Living Dead. And Romero sued the distributor, and they pulled, but it had actually run in a few theaters with that title.
Wow.
And so yeah, very, very much kind of in that vein. And I will say, on reflection, just having kind of come back and rewatched it recently, I'm kind of the opposite, when it comes to that movie. It's like, it's really kind of the first 2/3 I tend to like more than the final third. The final third is where things kind of fall apart for me a little bit. But let me throw this question at both of you. Have you ever seen a film called Let's Scare Jessica to Death? Because I think this film has a lot in common with Let's Scare Jessica to Death on like sort of a psychological.
Not yet. It is on my
Not yet.
list.
Same.
Yeah, check that out.
Okay.
Listeners out there, yeah, definitely check out, well, not only Messiah of Evil, but check out Let's Scare Jessica to Death, because you could almost sort of do them both really as sort of a double feature, because they're very tonally similar.
Interesting. That's another thing with this film, Messiah of Evil, the tone. So you mentioned earlier, are these zombies or are these vampires? Ultimately, it does not matter, in my opinion. But okay, so you mentioned in your article how you also say that, to kind of, you split the difference. It doesn't really matter, but if they're zombies, they're faster. So it's more like, and I feel like that has kind of risen to power as far as the zombie genre with the faster zombies. 28 Days Later, obviously,
Yeah,
possibly the first major place that was introduced, right?
that film is the gold standard for
Yes.
what I call the runners, as opposed to
Yes.
the lumberers.
Yes. But the interesting thing, so watching a little bit of Messiah of Evil again this morning, I realized they don't just run, like, so the thing with like 28 Days Later, the runners, they're compelled. It's like all id, right? So there's no reflection or recognition. It's just target, run, consume, or tear to pieces. And likewise, on the opposite end of the spectrum with Romero, which, so let's use the scene with Laura in the grocery store. For listeners that haven't seen it, this is like the most referenced scene, I think, in the movie, where one of the characters is she's walking the town, she's looking for a ride or whatever. She goes into a grocery store and she finds all these people eating just directly raw meat from the refrigerator case.
Yeah.
And then they notice her and then they chase her through the store. And when they catch her, and you see this a couple other points in the film, whenever they catch somebody, it looks exactly like Night of the Living Dead to me. Just the way that they all huddle around the person. And part of it's effects, right? Because then you don't have to actually see the gore. Like when you get into the actual Return of the Living Dead is, one of the first places in 1984 where like you're seeing them tear the skull case open and actually feast on the brains or whatever.
Yeah.
And you don't necessarily, Night of the Living Dead, it was smaller budget, so they couldn't show that as much.
Yeah.
So you see them kind of surround and just, cover the person. And then it's implied that they're eating them, or there'll be cutaway shots of them with meat.
Yeah.
So they do that. But when they're running, the interesting thing is they're not all id. They like stop, like that scene in the grocery store, they stop, they look up at her, and there's actual thought process. And then they follow her through the kind of cavernous aisles of the store and eventually overcome her because she can't get out the door that she arrives at. But the whole time, they seem to me to be these citizens that have not become either ravenous zombies or ravenous vampires, but this has just become part of their daily lives.
Yeah.
So they're still cogent, but this is just now what they do, which is a
Yeah.
really interesting like facet that I feel like is very easy to not even pick up on because of there's so much else going on.
Yeah, and they engage in like problem solving too. It's like how they corner, how they corner Laura, the character, Anitra Ford's character in the Ralphs. Which, by the way, the Ralphs I believe still exists. It's in Burbank on Victory Boulevard, I think.
I may have to go buy some ground beef, I think.
There you go. Perfect. And yeah, they outsmart, they deceive and outsmart police officers. And
yeah,
so these are thinking and problem solving, zombies. So which and yeah, you're right with like the taxi, and it's just sort of like they're just how do you work on a low budget, and you don't, and back they didn't even, back then it was just sort of like, are we going for an R or are we going for a PG? There was no PG-13.
Yeah.
So it was like, are we going for a PG or an R? That wasn't a consideration at all for them. So we're just going to shoot this crazy sequence, and then once the zombies descend on Laura, that's going to be this Eisensteinian montage, we're just throwing shots around, and that becomes even more psychologically, impactful.
Yeah. Let me ask both you guys this question. So Ray, you mentioned the ending is what really turns the film around for you, and the fact that,
well, I mean, it's not the only. I mean, there are
no, I know, but
like I think I don't know why, but like of the two different like towny attack moments, and the girls, I actually like the one in the theater more for some weird reason.
It's good.
I think it's because they just slowly kind of surround her, and at first it's just like she's not noticing, and you're seeing it, and then when she like realizes like how close they're all getting, it's, I don't know what it's like. It's like they're making a conscious decision to scare her too.
Yeah.
To not just come up on her and not just surround her, but also to be like, no, we're gonna creep the hell out of her. We're gonna scare the hell out of her before we get her. Like this, we're gonna have some fun with this. Because they also let her get out of the seat, get past them, and like start to check the doors, and like they're all just sitting there and like staring at her, and it's so creepy. I was like, that's really impressive.
Yeah,
it is. And so I'm wondering if, okay, so the movie kind of ends where it begins with this idea, and I guess I'll add a spoiler tag to the beginning of this. I mean, I don't feel like you can spoil this movie because I feel like you're not watching it again necessarily for the outcome or the plot or whatever. It's almost more you're watching it for the tone and for the visuals. But I will before the episode starts, I'll add that. So feel free to go, both of you guys, as far into this as you want. My question is, so it ends with this idea that Arletty's been in a hospital this whole time, and that maybe this didn't happen, which I don't get that at all. I'm pretty sure it did happen, and that it's just easier for society to relegate her to this space where they can be like, oh, she's nuts, we don't have to deal with this. But I remembered that being the beginning of the film, that like long shot of the hallway where she's kind of lit in a way where you can't quite see her form exactly, and she's coming towards you narrating. But that's actually not the beginning of the movie. The beginning of the movie, I was reminded this morning, the scene where there's just a guy running, right? And on a sidewalk next to it's like a garden wall or something. And then I think he falls, and there's a young girl that opens the door and comes out, and then he goes into this backyard where there's this pool. And then it almost seems like you don't know what he's running from. I mean, obviously it's assumed he's in Point Dune, it's the townsfolk. And then this girl kind of moves over to him, and it almost seems like, is this going to be like romantic? And then he seems like he feels safe, and then she cuts his throat.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting because, first of all, the way she's dressed and everything about that, and the fact that she uses a razor instead of consuming him or whatever. Do you guys think that was, so this was shot in 71, John, you said it came out in 73, 69. was the Manson family murders. And I just feel like the way that girl is dressed and everything about that scene was meant to draw people into the movie, almost like it's from a different movie.
Yeah, whether it's the subconscious of the filmmakers, just sort of seeping through what they do or not, I mean, that's obviously going to be on some people's minds, and that's obviously going to be, just sort of where things go. Because I mean, yeah, 69 was, of course, the Tate LaBianca murders, and the trial was in 70, so just throughout the pre-production. And yeah, that really, it's what that event. I've always sort of posited that event of the Manson murders as being what this one scholar refers to as an impact event, where you have this historical event that is so traumatic and shocking that it just alters subjectivities, especially on a cultural level. 9/11 is a perfect example of that. Kennedy assassination, perfect. That I just sort of put in the Manson murders. I know that some people would probably quibble with that, as to why that would be, historically significant, or the fact that, it would be like an impact event, sort of on such a small level. But it was, especially for that, for not only the Hollywood community, but also for the greater significance of the counterculture as well. So the appearance of that, of course, would just sort of really kind of trigger into mind this really change of perception of the counterculture movement. I always find that scene very interesting, because it's right after that character is killed, we get brought in to the film with the line from Arletty, "No one can hear you scream. No one can hear you scream." And the person who was just killed was Walter Hill, who went on to produce the film Alien, in which in space no one can hear you scream. So that just always blows my mind, whenever
oh my God.
I really kind of, whenever I dive into that and really kind of see that. Walter Hill, he actually shows up a couple of times, and he's in the back of the pickup truck, as well, later in the film. But it's really just sort of what's striking is just the colors of what she's wearing, and the colors play such a strong role. Yet in the movie theater sequence that, you were talking about, Ray, it becomes this kind of meta moment where, someone is killed just right after watching a film. The zombies, quote unquote, behave exactly like one would behave in a horror movie. So they're very sort of self-conscious. And then when the character Joy is finally killed by them, it's against this white screen. So you just get this absence of color just right at that moment. And I think if there's really kind of any moment that just ends up being very puzzling for some viewers, it's that. There's like a whole lot more, just really with how, Sean, I think you kind of mentioned how this was sort of cyclical, and this sort of, we kind of end where we begin. I wonder to myself, and I really don't have any source on this, how much of this was actually Hyuk and Katz doing, or whether it was the re-editing of the film from the distributor, because they had this whole elaborate sequence planned at the end that they shot a whole bunch of stuff that just didn't end up in the movie. Because Arletty, when we see her in the garden of the mental institution, we only see like one side of her face. They don't cut around, they never cut around to show the other side of her face, because there's this burn mark of a hand where the Messiah of evil comes out of the ocean and touches her with her hand and sort of burns the side of her face, which kind of would have given the ending like a different dimension. But instead, we kind of get this whole cyclical story. And whether that was Katz and Hyuk's intentions, or whether it was just part of studio re-editing, I don't know. Jury's out.
Interesting. So that makes me wonder now if, like, the thing that I said about how it reminded me of, like, especially like the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Carnival of Souls, like if that was just like the studio stepping in and being like, well, this is what works. We know this works. It's been done before. Let's take the safe route. That's
Oh,
interesting. It might be a possibility of that then. Huh.
that's very interesting. John, where can one read about this alternate ending?
I think you can't really read about it anywhere. I mean, it'll be in various places online. You know, maybe IMDb, probably, maybe Wikipedia. Although if it is on
Okay.
Wikipedia now, it would have been maybe a recent contribution because I don't remember reading about it on Wikipedia in 2019. But it's from the Huck and Cats commentary track on the Blu-ray, and they don't go into detail really about what was shot and what wasn't, why they decided to be a little coy about that. I'm not sure. Maybe they just sort of didn't want to set up expectations for a film that no one was ever going to see. But they describe that sequence. They describe, you know, what they shot. They show like, okay, that's the reason why the studio cut around, you know, our Letty in that manner, so we don't see like the burn mark on the side of her face, which would have just pulled people out of the story because there's no payoff to that. So, you know, that's just even more. It's like sort of like why Messiah of Evil is like a film that almost never was, that really was just kind of like, even to this very day, it's just sort of a constant work in progress.
That's fascinating. That just adds a whole nother level to it. I'm definitely gonna have to find this Blu-ray just so I can hear the commentary.
That makes a lot of sense, but I'm still glad it's out there. I mean,
Yeah.
Yeah.
it makes me think of, I don't know, John, if you've had a chance to look at Shutter, but like they recently, I feel like maybe about a month ago, they released this, I guess, I don't know how lost it was, but this lost film of Romero's. I'm totally
Amusement
blanking on
Park?
the name of it. Amusement Park.
Yeah, which I have not seen.
It's good. I mean, it definitely feels like incomplete. But I thought it was, I thought for what he did, I thought it was pretty effective, and like there were parts that definitely like got to me. The whole thing of this old, like, you know, the effects of aging, and like, you know, how society tends to take advantage of the elderly, and like, you know, either by ignoring them or abusing their trust, or just trying to strip them of whatever wealth they've attained in their lives. I felt it was pretty effective. Like there was a I, I had this moment after I finished watching it where I was like, I wanted to call my grandparents, tell them how much I love them. So I thought it did do its job, but like it did feel a little bit incomplete. Like he probably wanted to shoot more, and that maybe this is what he got done. And especially considering like it had been not seen for so long, that's probably part of the reason.
Yeah, no,
Interesting.
it's really true. And one of the things that really kind of draw me back to this film is that I guess some people, they kind of refer to this film as like sort of like an art house horror film, and they'll refer to the work of Ari Aster in that kind of way. But I mean, really, the truth of the matter is that, you know, yeah, I mean, horror cinema back then, you know, was like really where so many people came from under Roger Corman. Like Francis Ford Coppola cut his teeth on, you know, making horror films for Corman, as did Martin Scorsese, Jonathan Demme, and Ron Howard and other filmmakers. But what's really fascinated me is that art film has always kind of really performed the function of horror cinema, even when the subjects are not explicitly horror. And that's kind of something that I think has been very true recently, where you have like a lot of European art house cinema recently that they're not explicitly horror films in their subject matter, but they perform the functions of horror so effectively, like Lars von Trier's The House That Jack Built, or
Oh
yeah,
yeah,
the films,
absolutely.
yeah, the films of Lynn Ramsey, or Michael Haneke's Cache, and other films by Michael Haneke.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I mean, another film that this kind of made me think about, and I was talking to Sean about it the other day, was the movie Lost Highway, the Lynch film,
Yeah.
and how like I remember talking to people about it and saying like, "Well, it's a horror movie," and they're like, "It's not a horror movie; it's a drama." And I go, "No, it's a horror movie," because there was quite a bit of people that like I own the film, and I would loan it to people and say like, "Just watch it and then tell me what you think." And I I told Sean this story the other day. I actually wrote a paper about that for an English for an American literature course that I was taking, and I compared it to a book they were reading, and I felt bad because the professor had not seen the film. So I said, here's my copy. Watch it, and then let me know, like if you feel like I'm still being accurate." And she came back to me 2 weeks later, handed me the cassette, and I said, "Oh, how'd you like it?" She said, I couldn't watch it." And I went, What do you mean?" And she got about 15 minutes in, got too terrified, and turned it off. And I went,
Oh,
"There you go. It's a scary ass movie. There's some parts in there that are terrifying, and like,
Yeah.
but it's one of his more modern, unapproachable, like super artsy, like very dense. It's not going to be easy for you to figure out. You're going to sit after and think about this kind of movies, and like, yeah, there's a lot of horror that's like that, quite honestly.
yeah. I find sometimes that there are films that some people they find unapproachable, when that's really just sort of like a cover, or just sort of a code for something that's very complicated, complex, and inaccessible.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, well, definitely we've seen, I mean, and this is such a huge discussion in its own right, but we have seen cinema become so commodified that, I mean, I there are, I love some of the Marvel stuff. I really broke away from it for a couple of years because I was just like, I'm just done. I just, it scared me that at some point everybody was just going to work for Marvel, and that those were going to be only movies, and it terrifies me, and just hearing people, like I always go back to, heard Alan Ball say, American Beauty would never ever be made for the budget. And this is like, I want to say I heard an interview like 7-8 years ago where he said this.
Mhm.
And so now we're even further into, I mean, there are always exceptions, but for the most part, popular cinema it's just, it is what it is. It's Fast and the Furious and it's Iron Man, and nothing against those movies, but there needs to be other things, right? And so definitely, John, when you're talking about this kind of influx of like the art house, and it's funny how that creeps in, right? Where's the one thing now, the one genre or whatever, where you can kind of sneak these movies into a theater alongside, Doctor Strange and Fast 10, is horror. And
Yeah.
I mean, Midsummer, I still to this day am both so just ecstatic that got the release and the reception that it did, and just that I had the chance to see that in not just, I mean, it would have been fine in an art house theater, but I saw that in like an AMC,
Same here.
like
Yeah.
surrounded by people on a Friday night.
Yeah. That was, I couldn't believe it. So it's great because it's like, independent distributors like A24 and Neon and Annapurna, they sort of have kind of allowed for, art cinema by stealth, in the horror genre, just sort of like, it's sort of like the stealthy way to kind of keep art cinema in circulation, alongside, Fast and Furious 9.
Yeah, and actually, the director Prano Bailey Bond, who did Censor, a movie all three of us have seen, she's interviewed in the newest issue of Fangoria, and she talks about the fact that, the interviewer asked her about this like renaissance of horror or whatever, and she basically says, I think right now it's just, look, in the 80s, which is what censor was about, there, the video nasties, and these movies were actually condemned and policed and ferreted out, and then at some point that relaxed, and then the money people started to see like, oh, horror gets people in the theater, doesn't it? And then you started to see the commercialization of that stuff, and then that hit a wall and kind of died for a while, and now we're definitely seeing it too. And that was her point, is I think right now it's just the money people are seeing this and saying, hey, this is a way that we can get people in the theater. Horror gets people like horror. It gets people to spend money to go see it, and you can even address issues. Obviously, Jordan Peele does that very well. I mean, there's plenty of filmmakers also that do that. Just pops into my mind because I think she directly references him in the article. But yeah, it's a great time to be a fan of this stuff.
It is. And by the way, Prano, if you're listening, I'm kind of curious if you were inspired by Adam Agoyan's film, The Adjuster, which has a similar kind of subplot where like one of the characters is a censor for the Canadian Board of Film, and only, instead of watching video nasties and like grotesque horror all day long, the character's watching pornography all day long, and what that kind of does to her internal emotional landscape and perception of the world. And just whereas here, Prado Bailey Bond just does something so unique, taking a little piece of film history and just realized, what if someone became traumatized by what if a film censor became traumatized, and in that trauma discovered a clue that could unlock a decades old mystery.
Yeah. Oh man, I so want to go on a deep dive with you guys on that movie. I'm realizing like I'm perched on a precipice with it right now, because I feel like we could talk about that. There's so much to talk about.
Yeah.
But I'm going to do this right now. I'm going to say, let's John, come back and let's do that. Especially maybe right after the Blu-ray hits and it's more accessible, because I also hope, I'm really hoping, I'm going to guarantee Shudder's going to pick that up.
Yeah.
And more people will see it, because I want to deep dive. That movie is, I mean, I've seen it 3 times now, and it's I don't know, there's just so much there. There's so much there.
I'd totally be game for that.
Okay, we will definitely do that.
That's awesome. It'd be great to have you back. But in reference to what you were just saying about like worrying about like these big movies being out, I feel like one of the things that has been good is that, especially for horror as a genre, is that, let me give a little background. Probably some of the listeners know this already, John, but I haven't classically watched a lot of horror growing up. Like a lot of it has been in the last few years when Sean started the podcast. And originally when he said he wanted me to come on, I said, I don't watch a lot of horror. How am I going to be good at this? And he went, no, because you have an outside perspective. And so there has been moments where like, I look at something like they say like, oh, this is so good. And I go, really? Because the development was there for me on the story. And like, I've realized as a genre, like there's certain things you have to forgive as you're watching it. But having that outside perspective, I think one of the things that's nice about having these like big, like the cinemas be filled with things like Marvel and DC movies and Fast and Furious movies, it has pushed the people who want to make horror into making better horror, into making really good quality stuff. And instead of like just going like, well, I'm just going to have a killer and he's going to be out in the woods and he's just going to slash people to death. They've went, okay, I got to make something good. I have to make something impressive. So you have the Ari Asters, you have like the remake of Suspiria, which I think is fantastic.
So
it takes in the whole
wonderful.
Oh, isn't it?
The Guadagnino film is I would actually much prefer to return to that film than the Argento one, if you could believe it.
I believe
I
it.
understand. I get it because I like the colors. I love the colors in the Argento. I think it's great. But man, that one's so loaded. That movie is so impressive, and you don't feel its length while you're watching it.
No,
It's so good.
I saw, John, you actually have an article on your website that I just discovered it the other day. I haven't read it yet. And it's timely for us because I just 3 months ago saw Possession for the first time. And then I showed it to Ray like 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
And we have another guy that comes on the podcast, that's on the podcast, Anthony, who he owns it. He imported it from, I feel like, Poland, because it's notoriously hard to find on disc, and it's not streaming anywhere that I can tell. But and so you have an article that's about the Suspiria 2018 and Possession, which immediately dovetailed with what I was telling Ray about Possession, where it's like Berlin is such the perfect location for this movie. You know, oh man, it's just another one. Good Lord.
Yeah, no, it's they both work so well, and just sort of how much, you know, they were really kind of inspired by it, and it's sort of like when we kind of ask ourselves, it's like, why horror? It ends up, it's because what both of those films plus Messiah of Evil, you know, and plus every other film that we've mentioned, you know, what it's all about. You know, it's not like, you know, are we scaring the shit out of each other, you know, and you know, how you know, like not being able to sleep at night, you know, it's like, no, although there is that as well. But you know, it's all about discovery. It's and it's all about really kind of mapping out the interior of one and their shadow side, you know, and I think, you know, you really kind of have to ask yourself, you know, like, are there parts of my own emotional landscape that are better serviced by horror than by romantic comedy or you know, action films and car chases, and that's kind of another reason why I'm doing a series, a deep dive on The Shining for the Seattle International Film Festival this October. And one of the things I'm going to get into about why that's one of the greatest horror films of all time is because it exemplifies the fact that horror is such a strong form of cartographic cinema. And cartographic cinema is just sort of is something where it's where the cinematic form, the editing, the cinematography, and the art design maps out either an actual location or the interior of a mind, like in the mind of the viewer. And I think that film just sort of maps out, you know, sort of one's internal psyche better than any other horror film by how much it allows the viewer to project on it. I think Messiah of Evil kind of does that a little bit, you know, in its own way, maybe in a less impressive way, but it's still, you know, there's still a lot of joy to be found, you know, in that. But Guadagnino's Suspiria, I think, did that par excellence, at least for me.
Wow. That deep dive, is that going to be an article? Is it going to be a podcast or?
Oh no, it's going to be virtual. It'll be like a virtual event. So yeah, and I'll be as soon as it goes live, I'll be putting it on my website under events, so people can go and look at it. And also, Seattle International Film Festival Center will have it on their website in about a week or so.
I'll definitely, when it comes. You said October.
October, yeah, we're
perfect.
We're honing in on. We're playing around with 2 different dates right now, so we're just sort of honing in on it. So yeah, join us for Why The Shining is the greatest horror film of all time, and you get to kind of, you know, for anybody out there that's fans of anime, you're all going to learn about what anime has to do with The Shining.
Oh, that's interesting. I'm not an anime fan, but that's interesting.
Fascinating.
I'm not either, but you know, it's like I respect the form enough to interrogate the relations between animation and other forms.
Yeah, well said. Well said. I mean, nothing against it. I love Cowboy Bebop, but other than that, I can't quite. Okay, but so let me go back. So let's do this. I want to just not rapid fire, but I want to kind of posit some stuff to you guys and see what you think about this. So, John, in your article, you mentioned how we're basically seeing, and the example you use in either of those townie attacks is right. I love the way you called it, the townie attack. That's perfect. But you're seeing the movie Messiah of Evil. There's kind of this thing where it's the counterculture or the artists against or being attacked by, consumed by kind of the status quo, the suits and ties, the establishment, and that's definitely there. And I would even wonder, while we were just talking about the whole tie with the first scene of the Manson family, possibly that maybe that is there because that is where, like John, you said, that's kind of what maybe turned society off to that 60s counterculture, where that became suddenly very dark and dangerous. And then you definitely saw historically through the 70s that kind of hippy dippy love everybody turned into, I forget who, somebody famously said it, where it's like pot and free love became, heroin and like black magic and murder and just how it just, changed. But anyway, so you are seeing this struggle between the counterculture of the artists and then just kind of society. And I guess my question is, what ties? So, okay, the Messiah of Evil, which is the establishment, is waiting for his return, right? And he is, they say later on, like somebody that was in the Donner Party.
Yeah.
So that's the Donner Party is, if you look at it, it's like the states of the Wild West. The Donner Party are settlers that fail. So they actually fail to establish a society that then he returns to this society that has, thus been established and spreads this kind of consuming contagion against the counterculture. So how does the Donner Party, which is a failed establishing of society, tie into this? Or am I just totally misreading this and I'm cuckoo?
No. I mean, if you're reading it, I think it'd be safe to assume that this idea has crossed Joachim Katz's mind, at least a couple of times. But we see the Messiah on horseback, riding through what is like clearly like Topanga Canyon, Calabasas area, and this is it is sort of representing this sort of old class of Southern California turn of the century booster culture, that and this really kind of old conservative guard, of like Southern California, like this sort of old mythology, like this mythologized past of Southern California, and this sort of like looking back, whereas like the counterculture, what is being sort of gobbled up by this past, is sort of all about looking forward and not existing in the past. I think that's sort of one way of looking at it, where you have like the sort of old conservative class of Southern California history with something else that has come to embody Southern California and the national psyche, especially when it comes to beaches, because beaches, before we think of beaches today, I mean, maybe anything north of Torrance perhaps, as being sort of a very much kind of a sort of part of like expensive housing and sort of part of like kind of like elite, where in reality it was like just sort of really kind of like a location, a symbolic location of something opposite of that. So really to kind of like summarize that thought, it's just sort of about, it's really kind of just a classic horror trope of the past, which sort of the suits and ties, silent majority, conservative California, coming back, to wreak havoc on the present. This classic horror idea of history is the past's unfinished business.
Ooh. Wow, well said. Ray, what do you think? Am I nuts?
No, I think that well, one thing I was trying to remember the exact scene. There's a scene where I and John referencing a little bit there, where he's like a hunter. I think it's a diary or something, or is it someone who tells a story that a hunter met the Messiah, and that he was the member of the Donner Party, and he tells him that the reason he survived was becoming this evil thing, like becoming literally consuming other people. But I was trying to think about like that, how like, and it's interesting that he gets here and then he walks into the scene and he keeps coming back in and going back out of it. But I mean, it does go back to the whole concept, like John was just saying, of like, he's this older version of things, and he doesn't take over the young people. He doesn't take over like the artists, things like that. He takes over the old, like the townies, and like they're the ones that get turned and become these monsters. And he's like that he has that recurring past. I don't know, maybe it just feels like something about it feels like, because of the moon and the whole lunar cycle, like it's like a season almost.
Well, it's 100
like
years, right?
Yeah, it's every 100 years.
Charlie at the beginning is talking about, and that's a great horror trope right there too. It immediately made me think of, for whatever reason, because it's 1,000 times, but Dagon,
Stuart Gordon.
Thank you, Stuart Gordon. My God, the idea that the town drunk, Charlie even says, like, I get drunk and sleep on the sidewalk like a dog, so they don't bother me, but I see things, and so now I'm gonna, he tells Arletty, like your father. Gord, thank you, Stuart Gordon. My God. Oh wow. Yeah, I don't know. It was just another interesting trope, and the bum is the interesting trope. But what I was going for, and I got sidetracked trying to remember Stuart Gordon's name, is he says 100 years ago the moon turned red. He came out of the hills, and then all of this happened, and so it is cyclical. There's some some kind of cycle at play here, which I think. I now I'm mixing my articles, and I don't remember, John, if you mentioned this in your essay or if I read it somewhere else. There is definitely an indirect Lovecraftian, and so first of all, like, that is a term that is so over and wrongfully used these days, where some of the stuff people are like, oh, this is Lovecraftian. It's like, no, it's not.
No, Messiah of Evil's kind of Lovecraftian in that, like, not only is it a very dreamy world, but just the way that people behave.
Yes.
That film, like, they behave like they're in a dream themselves, and they're just like totally, completely, just out of it. I mean, I guess that is where the Lovecraftian thing comes in. And I think, that moment with the homeless guy, Elisha Cook, who is like about as old school Hollywood as you can get, Maltese folk, and that. So like, there's definitely something there with that guy.
That's a great scene. Also, just as a quick aside, I just want to point out that I love the fact that, so the gas station is probably my favorite scene. I don't know why. There's just something about that gas station. And John, you talk a lot in your article about the gentleman that wrote 26 gas stations, or I didn't write it.
Ed Ruscha.
Ed Ruscha, the book, the paintings, and how the gas station scene like already gives you this foreboding, and then we get into this idea of chromophobia. David Batchelor, right? That was his term he came up with, and you talk about the idea of color versus kind of color being something that is bad to the establishment because it's exotic, or it's gay, or it's whatever, whatever perceived thing. And Ray had a really, really interesting point about this last night. Do you remember, Ray? I wanted to ask you to run this by John and see what he thought.
And it didn't hit me until the scene where I forget the name of the character, but he picks her up and he's driving her in the truck and he eats the rat. And that was that, if the effect of the return of the Messiah is that all these people start to become very ghoulish, the white people in the town already become more pale, so they're almost like white as sheets, and like their eyes are very hollow looking, and they don't look, they obviously look unnatural. And my curiosity was that, like, he's obviously he's obviously this albino, but like I thought to myself, what are we supposed to maybe think that before he was a regular black man, and that he maybe got like the evil has started taking over, so like it's bleaching him out almost.
Yeah, I think that's a fair interpretation, and it does fit in with the chromophobia argument as well, like this sort of fear of invasion by color, and that's the filmmakers really playing on that. An interesting thing about that character of like the albino trucker, Benny Robinson is the guy, the actor's name. He is an African-American gentleman, and with a skin condition, renders his skin and his hair white. And yeah, while he was on set, he'd be talking to the caterers, and they didn't know this, and the caterers were just sort of dropping all sorts of racist diatribe around him without even really without realizing who it was they were talking to. And
Wow.
And the producer knew Benny Robinson, would go and pick him up from his house every day. And so so I would definitely say with the character of the character of the albino trucker, it feeds into that critique in the film, and this sort of like in fear of invasion of color that is really, really kind of a feature of the conservative establishment. And so I think, yeah, you're right, Ray, but not just on top of that, I think the filmmakers saw in Benny Robinson himself an opportunity to really, really drive the point home.
Yeah. Wow. Oh man, the scene where he picks up Laura and eats the rat is.
I mean, there's so much about that scene that's unusual. It's not just the rat; it's that, like, because if that's the case, it's interesting because, okay, when they do start to turn, the other ones we don't see exhibit the ability of speech. Yet, see, he still has the ability of speech. So, I mean, does it suggest then that, like, that because they were already white, that they lost that ability to speak, and that because he started as a black man, that like he still retained some of his humanity, and it's retained in the fact that, like, because he doesn't try to eat her, and like he's not there for the consumptions, so he's eating rats. And like, I don't know, there's something about like even the listening of the Wagner, like it's such a
Yeah, it's a strange.
It's not just classical music. It is like the most white classical music ever. It was composed by a German, and it's all about German strength.
Yeah.
Like it's like, damn, how much whiter can it get? And he's driving them around.
Yeah. Oh man,
he's driving them around. I just can't help it. There's something about that I feel like is it expressing more of the whiteness of this spreading. It's like this.
And really, like, gentlemen, this is the thing that I love. This is my motivation behind the podcast, and just so much is like when you really watch a film and you think about it, there's and like Lynch is great with this because he doesn't want to give you any answers. Wherever your mind goes, he'll be like, sure, good. That's what I want. I want my audience to think about it and for them to make their own conclusions. And really, like, whether or not some of this stuff was intentional by the filmmakers for Messiah Evil, whether it was accidental, whether they wouldn't, some of this stuff they might be like, oh, I hadn't thought of that. You hear things like that in interviews with filmmakers all the time. But any film, well, maybe not any, but so many films, really, it's like that first watch is like staring into your reflection in a body of water. and then from there you can dive in, and there can be, you know, untold depths that you can get to. And that's why I just love talking about this stuff with other people that look at it that way, because look what we just did for Messiah of Evil. I mean, not anything against it, but I mean, it definitely, I feel like, you know, John, you make the point in your article, it's so underrated and underseen.
Yeah. And hopefully through, you know, podcasts such as this, you know, it'll continue to find an audience. I mean, I don't see it really as being, you know, entered into canon, you know, alongside, you know, The Exorcist or The Shining, but you know, really people, I'm excited to hear, you know, what other people take away from this film, and not just people, you know, who are really into film, but people who are like into other form of visual arts, like painters and photographers. You know, I'd be very curious as to what their takeaways are from the film.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Closing thoughts, and then John, I want you to tell the listeners where they can find you. I know you have a podcast that I've now listened to the first episode of, and I really enjoyed. But before we go there, because my headphones just gave me the first like low battery, so we're gonna wrap it soon. But anything else? And again, John, I'll start with you as the guest. Anything you want to like close with, takeaways, whatever, anything about the film?
Yeah, all I would say is check out this film. The legacy of the new Hollywood, the filmmakers that came out of the late 60s and into the 70s, you know, the people that brought us films like The Godfather, Taxi Driver, Apocalypse Now, and The Last Picture Show and what have you. Yeah, it's this powerful and important legacy in the history of American cinema, but look at films such as this and really do not write off the importance of filmmakers like Roger Corman and Russ Myers, you know, and others in sort of like the B movie department, because that really kind of set the stage for a lot of alternative cinemas that we would start to see in the 80s and into the 90s and even today. So don't overlook independent cinema, B movies as part of it. There's one book I'd recommend. I don't remember the author's name, but it's a very easy title to remember. It's called Coming This Wednesday to a Theater or Drive-In Near You. And it's sort of all about this sort of 70s shadow cinema. So, you know, if you're fans of Taxi Driver and Apocalypse Now, check out this book. Don't write those off these films. There's some gems out there.
Very cool.
Ray, any closing thoughts?
Oh, well, you know, I think the one thing I'd add is just to add on to that is that, like, yeah, check out this film, but you know, maybe it won't become like part of canon, but I you know, I think that one of the things about horror as a genre is it has the ability for to borrow a term from music, is like there's great B-side stuff. There's stuff that, like, you know, you see the Romeros, you see the Argentos, you see those films because people tell you about them. But then there's stuff out there that like is worth investigating, worth deep diving into. There's Carnival of Souls. There's for some reason I'm blanking, but like there's stuff to be found, and Possession is another one. Like, you know, if it were more watched, if it were more out there, then there would be at least a Blu-ray or DVD, at least a DVD edition available in the US, and it's not. It's something you have to hunt down and find out. But sometimes those things that you have to hunt down and find for your own and get a chance to watch finally are really worth the time. You know, Sean knows the story, but John, when I first became a big Lynch fan, like I couldn't, you know, it was just impossible to see Eraserhead. And I read about it online and I saw pictures and everything, and I was trying to watch this film. And then finally they did a retrospective of his work at LACMA about back in like 97. And they showed it along with Dune. which I still find it was such an entertaining experience, because the first thing they did was show Dune, which were all these people were there for Dune, and it's where it's kitschiness. And then I knew what to expect, but the rest of the audience did not. And they fell silent. It was almost like they were in terror of the film for the whole hour and a half. And I was like, this is the best way to see this goddamn movie.
Wow.
Like, people were uncomfortably laughing during the whole my knees moment. But the whole rest of the movie, like, I could see people turning to their friend and being like, what is this? And I had to wait to see that. And then once I saw it, I then had to hunt down a video store that had it. And I went and rented it so I could dub my copy of it. And I had that and Unshin Andalou on a tape together. And I would loan it to people and be like, these are both worth watching. Check them out.
Yeah.
And there is stuff like that you have to hunt them out, but they are worth hunting down. They are worth sharing with people. El Topo wasn't on a DVD until I feel like 2005. So however you get to decimate this, if you see something and you like it and you want to spread it to people, spread it, because that's how we keep these things alive. And a lot of these things are worth keeping alive, and they aren't the canon, but they deserve to be. They're the great B-sides, and don't neglect the B-sides.
Well said.
Yeah.
Well, okay, guys. So John, as we close, where can people find you?
They can find me online, johntrafton.com, where I post articles, whatever I really feel like writing. Got an article on the go right now that I expect to drop towards the end of this month called "Do We Deserve the Xenomorph?" I also do a podcast called "This Movie Saved My Life" with photographer Miles Fortune. We're going to be recording another episode in another week or so look for that to drop. We're going to be pulling an all-nighter watching movies and then recording about the experience. And you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at John Trafton Film.
Awesome. Well, okay. So I implore our listeners to seek you out, because I feel like, and I barely scratched the surface, but I really enjoyed the first episode of your podcast, which was about color and cinema. And I really have enjoyed, the first article I read on your website, I really, really enjoyed. So, and please, I will keep in touch. When you do the event for The Shining, let me know and I'll promote it, on my social media and on the show. And then also, again, I would love, let's say somewhere around the time, I think Censor drops on DVD and Blu-ray I know it's September. I feel like it's the 8th of September. I'm going to be out of town for a while at the end of September. So maybe we can fit it in either, after the Blu-ray drops, or maybe when I get back, whatever, but we'll keep in touch. I'd love to have you back, especially to talk about that and anything else.
That sounds
good.
Love that.
If you're willing to do an episode, John, on I'm totally blanking on it right now. Suspiria.
Yeah.
Oh, that would be good too.
And Tori would love to do that one, Sean.
Yeah, she would.
Tori's one of our contributors, and she loves that film. She loved it.
Oh yeah, you want keep me in mind for that. I'd love to do that as well.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Okay, well then, for the Horror Vision Horror Podcast, I'm Sean.
I'm Ray.
Our guest has been John Trafton, and we'll be back soon with another episode. But in the meantime, find Messiah Evil, watch it, and then read John's article. All right.
Yes, absolutely.